Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top headlines of this hour. A bipartisan delegation of U.S. lawmakers arrived in Copenhagen to meet the leaders of Denmark and Greenland. This comes amidst pressure from U.S. President Donald Trump, who sees attaining the island as a key part of U.S. national security. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney and Chinese President Xi Jinping are adding to the list of measures to slash tariffs, including a landmark deal for Canadian visitors to enter China for visa-free. This is the first meeting between the leaders of the two nations in 8 years. The UN Security Council holds emergency talks as Iran accuses the U.S. of fueling unrest and Russia warns against foreign interference. Western powers threaten sanctions, Iranian dissidents warn of mass killings, and the White House says 800 executions are planned. Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado presents her Nobel Peace Prize medal to U.S. President Donald Trump at the White House. U.S. official confirms Trump will keep the medal, which he praised as a sign of mutual respect. China said it resolutely opposes a U.S.-Taiwan deal cutting tariffs and boosting Taiwan's investment in America. Beijing urges Washington to follow the One China policy as it claims Taiwan as its territory. South Korea's impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol is sentenced to 5 years in prison for abuse of power, obstructing justice, and falsifying documents. The court says his 2024 martial law move caused a national political crisis, and he showed no remorse. Israeli forces kill at least 10 Palestinians and wound several in attacks across Gaza. The violence follows the U.S. announcement of a second phase of the ceasefire deal. Russian President Vladimir Putin discusses the situation in Iran in separate calls with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. Putin has said that Moscow is willing to mediate in the region. Now for this hour, we start with Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said a Ukrainian delegation is heading to the United States for talks focused on security guarantees and a broader prosperity package for the country. Speaking on Friday, Zelensky has said that Ukraine hopes to gain clarity on Russia's position on peace talks, accusing Moscow of stalling diplomatic efforts. He has stressed that Ukraine needs security guarantees that extend beyond U.S. President Donald Trump's term, warning that ultimatums are not an effective tool of diplomacy. Zelensky also revealed that Ukraine had been short of missiles for several air defense systems until Friday morning. If progress is made, he said any agreement could be signed in Davos, where global leaders are set to meet. Now for this discussion, we welcome Dr. Asta Chadha. She's an Associate Professor of International Relations in Ritsumeikan University, joins us live from Kyoto. Thank you very much, Dr. Chadha, for joining us again. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Asuma.
Thank you. Now, looking at this, what can we expect from this UN and Zelensky's delegation going ahead? And what do you think are in the agenda right now?
I mean, the Europe in general together, specifically yes. Ukraine, is looking at United States as an effective mediator, probably also because there isn't much choice they have given the kind of security needs Ukraine requires US to pledge, in the defense of Ukraine. And what they're looking at is very specific demands that President Zelensky wants for his nation. Those include an increased multi-year security guarantee, something he probably wants should last legally binding, in a legally binding manner, something which should last despite changes in US administration or despite cycles of elections that might take place in the US. So he needs more commitment from the United States towards a very long-term bilateral security agreement that potentially could be signed. So he's eyeing that. He's eyeing the fact that even though US seems to have brought Russia on board with regard to a draft draft peace plan, he wants this to actually work like a peace plan. He doesn't want this. I mean, from President Zelensky's perspective, he's looking at this peace plan as very pro-Russia, specifically in terms of the territories that Ukraine does not want to cede. So for them, it is still a matter of sovereignty, and it's still a matter of territory that that President Zelensky sees as part of Ukraine that they do not want to give up. They want increased funding, specifically increased defense funding, which they want US and their partners to cover at least 50% of. And we are talking about hundreds of billions of US dollars only in the year 2026 towards defense. And that brings me to the fourth most important priority that President Zelensky has, which is, as you were mentioning earlier, they need urgent delivery of air defense systems, not only because Ukraine continues to still be a conflict zone, but because they also want to ensure that their energy infrastructure remains secure, given the temperatures, given that they fear that there might be a strike during the winters that could cripple not just how military is trying to combat Russian forces, but also might impact how people in general are feeling insecure in that environment. And there are so many other things that President Zelensky wants. I mean, but these are the most important ones. Now, is he willing to also assure, as part of that 19-point peace plan, what US has proposed? Will President Zelensky agree to it? We still need to see. There are some things which probably are going to be difficult to implement. For example, holding an election within 100 days of the ceasefire, and if this peace plan goes through. Is Ukraine secure enough to hold an election in that short window? Or the fact that Ukraine is required to give linguistic and religious rights specifically to its Russian speakers within Ukraine, and make sure that there is no discrimination against them, whether it's in media or in education or in politics. I mean, those are the things that Ukraine will need to think of. But I think as of now, currently, given the state of their defense systems, which are crippled, the fact that Ukraine looks at the entire 19-point peace plan as very pro-Russia, I think this is a very important meeting and very significant one, specifically from the perspective of Ukraine, that seeks more US commitment to Ukrainian peace.
Thank you for highlighting that. Oh, you have covered everything, and I was thinking what to ask now. So, as you know, you mentioned it's very urgent for Ukraine, and Ukraine is desperate to gain. Do you think that the support from EU and the coalition of the willing, is there any fatigue amongst them? Do you see that they're distracted because of Greenland and US situation right now?
I mean, of course, EU as a whole also feels in a flux at this moment, because they don't know which way United States is going to go with regard to what President Trump and his administration demands of Europe. So it's no longer about seeking commitment in terms of monetary resources or in terms of putting down the European forces on the borders between Ukraine and Russia, because clearly the Europeans are willing to do that. They are willing to put forth their own peacekeeping forces to ensure that there is no more conflict. So, what is it that is making them feel so unsure? And that is precisely, as you highlighted, is the fact that within Europe, there now is a lot of doubt with regard to President Trump and what exactly he wants to seek, when he says that he would want to have Greenland more secure. Because anyway, Greenland and the way Europe and America have remained partners for a very long time, the US interests seem very well secured within Greenland. And if President Trump is unwilling to look at it the same way, this really weakens the alliance. It weakens not only European security as a whole or the European US coalition as a whole, it also weakens drastically NATO. It reduces the trust factor that these powers in the West have maintained for a very long time. And I must mention here very quickly, there's also a question, as you mentioned, what exactly is President Zelensky so worried about? Is the fact that, we haven't heard a lot of movement on those proposals by the US. For instance, US proposed that they're going to use Russian assets, the seized Russian assets, to fund Ukrainian reconstruction. What happened to that? We're not hearing much about it. There was a talk about demilitarized zones, creating a buffer zone. Would that be created to own the Ukrainian territory? Or would Russia be willing to give up some of what it controls in the name of that territory? Again, that's a question mark. Would President Trump be willing to increase the proposed 15 years of security guarantee to 50 years? Because remember, Ukraine is looking at it in a post-Trump scenario. They just don't want security up until President Trump is in office. They want a security for a very, very long term, no matter who's in power. So those are the things I think in general are of concern, not just to President Zelensky, but also to Europe as a whole, to make sure that despite the idiosyncrasies that this administration is demonstrating, Ukrainian peace and Ukrainian security are paramount within the US strategic thought. I think that is what they're looking to achieve.
Right. Thank you for laying it out all there for us, Dr. Chadha. Please stay with us as we stay on the topic. Now, moving the focus and adding Greenland, U.S. Democratic Senator John Shaheen has said that the debate over Greenland makes so little sense. During a talk at Copenhagen University, Shaheen is part of a bipartisan U.S. lawmaker delegation in Copenhagen to reassure Denmark and Greenland leaders of congressional support despite President Donald Trump's threats to seize Greenland. Let's listen into what more she has shared.
I'm here today because millions of Americans are deeply concerned about the recent rhetoric of the United States taking over Greenland, either buying it or using military force. And I think that rhetoric doesn't just undermine our relationship, both with Denmark and with Greenland, but also with the other NATO countries and with Europe. It undermines NATO at a time when our adversaries seek to benefit from division. Just the suggestion that the U.S. would take Greenland by force does real damage, not just to the relationship with Greenland, with Denmark, but to America's own national security. It erodes decades of hard-won confidence among allies, and it weakens the sense of security that comes with it. And that rhetoric plays right into the hands of our greatest adversaries, Russia.
Trump has reiterated that the U.S. needs Greenland and that Denmark cannot be relied upon to protect the island, while stating something will work out regarding the future governance of the Danish territory. Now for this discussion, we welcome back Dr. Asta Chadha. She's joining us from Kyoto. Thank you very much, Dr. Chadha, for staying with us. Now, as you mentioned earlier in our discussion, that this move by U.S. or Trump in particular has weakened the alliance of NATO and the trust factor is abused and affected. It seems like it has also affected the trust between federal government and state government or the U.S. Trump administration. Now we see that U.S. Democratic senators have visited Denmark, taking Denmark's side. How do you think that Trump will be eyeing this, and do you think the frustration might lead him to say something or do something again? What can we make out of this, the deepening division between this, even affecting the international relations right now?
Well, let's try and understand what is the Trump logic here, or the logic of his whole administration with regard to Greenland. They're saying that it's a national security issue. They're saying that Greenland is a security black hole. They're saying that Denmark cannot adequately defend its 27,000 miles of coastline from the Russian and Chinese incursions. But the truth is that if we look into those arguments, they don't really fall exactly true. US wants access to Greenland, it says, because it doesn't really control it yet. That's not true. As a result of its partnership with the Europeans in general, with the EU, and now with NATO, US does already, the 1951 treaty does guarantee significant military rights to the United States. So there, that argument goes out of the window. The second thing that US seems to be demanding again is the fact that Greenland has a lot of critical minerals that are essential for the United States to challenge the Chinese hegemony when it comes toward the securitization of the critical mineral supply chain. Again, we heard the Greenlandic and Danish leaders expressing complete willingness and alacrity to partner with the United States when it comes to mineral extraction without a change in status of sovereignty of Greenland. If it is the access to Greenland that matters to the Trump administration, the Europeans would be more than happy to agree with the United States because US is a very important ally and they wouldn't want to deny that. That's one. Two, they wouldn't want to fracture the Western alliance to Russia's benefit. On one hand, they're trying to secure the US interest and US guarantees when it comes to Ukrainian defense. They wouldn't want to throw it out of the window in the name of US, a little bit of a conflict over Greenland and a difference in perspectives. So now this delegation that has gone there to assure the Europeans, I mean, on one hand, it's a good step to show that there are others, who are thinking this in a very practical, very pragmatic manner. They do not think that any sort of a conflict or flaring of this issue is in benefit of anyone. At the same time, from a European perspective, this is very confusing. Even though there are people in the administration or these leaders who've gone to talk to the Europeans, even though this might be seen as a welcome step of people beyond the administration looking at the Greenland issue, like I said, in a better, more pragmatic security manner, most probably these people don't have enough power. I mean, we know if President Trump has decided on something, he would probably want to, in some way, instrumentalize those threats, instrumentalize those ideas of annexation of an ally territory, which completely goes against the principle of NATO, which was precisely based on respecting national sovereignty. So is the European pillar safe in itself? I think this is something that European leaders are already wondering about. They're already worried about it. They're trying to find a neutral, predictable protector in the United States, which they're kind of potentially failing to achieve with the talks with the United States. Now, how likely is it that US is actually going to make a kinetic move? It's difficult to say at this point, but if the Europeans do agree with the US and its presence and secure its interests, it's very likely that President Trump would probably also look at Greenland as a potential area where they could have better partnerships, where they could have a leverage for United States in terms of its interests, and drop all the ideas of annexation or forceful threats that are currently being made by the administration.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asta Chadha, for joining us today and sharing that deep insight with us on NewsX World. Now we move on to Canada. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, in a press conference in Beijing, has discussed Canada's evolving relationship with China, stating that it has become more predictable compared to the US. Carney has highlighted that recent diplomatic engagements, including candid dialogues with Chinese President Xi Jinping, had led to a more stable and effective partnership. However, he has emphasized that Canada's ties with the US remain broader and more multifaceted. Carney's remarks come amidst ongoing US tariffs and strained relations under the Trump administration, as well as Canada's efforts to diversify its trade relationships. He has also announced trade deals with China, including the reduction of tariffs on Canadian canola seeds and the importation of Chinese electric vehicles. Let's hear what Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has shared.
The one comparison I will give you with the United States, our relationship, this is no insight, is much more multifaceted, much deeper, much broader than it is with China. But yes, in terms of the way that our relationship has progressed in recent months with China, it is more predictable, and you see results coming.
Now we move on to Iran. Iranians are taking part in funerals in Isfahan and Hamadan for martyrs killed in the wave of protests, which the authorities have dismissed as riots. The protest movement in Iran has subsided after a crackdown that has killed thousands under an internet blackout 1 week after the start of the biggest protest in years, challenging the Islamic Republic's theocratic system. According to media reports, around 3,000 people have been arrested during the recent protests in Iran. However, rights groups have estimated up to 20,000 people who have been arrested. Meanwhile, Switzerland has summoned Iran's ambassador in Bern to voice its greatest concern over Iran's crackdown on nationwide protests. Monica Schumez-Kyrgos, head of the ministry's Middle East and North Africa division, has said that with the summons, Switzerland's foreign ministry wants to convey that they condemn such kind of violence. Now for this discussion, we welcome Mr. Sol Sadka. He's a political commentator, joins us live from Tel Aviv. Thank you very much, Mr. Sadka, for joining us again. Good to see you. Now, looking at this, what more can you share with us on, this ongoing Iranian protests and also the crackdown by the government? What do we know so far?
Right now, we know very little because the internet's been cut off for the past 5 days.
Yes.
Beginning of that 5-day period, it seems, within 48 hours, the Iranian regime has killed anywhere from 3,000 to 20,000 protesters in cold blood, with the bodies piling high in the streets. It's one of the most sickening massacres by a government of its citizens in 100 years. It's shocking. It's really disturbing. What is going to happen in the end is the regime will eventually fall, whether it falls in this round of protests or at some point in the future it will, because they have completely run out of money. They have no longer got any way to pay for their regime, to pay off the officials and the security forces. Large numbers of regime officials are already leaving the country or have sent their families out of the country. Others are planning their withdrawal. And we can see that all the people that have been involved in these massacres, their names are going to go down in history. And they are likely to find themselves at some point in the not so distant future in Western jails awaiting war crimes trials. Or at the same time, they might be facing the justice of their own people, whether it be in courts or by the mob. They have made a very serious error. They had the opportunity to make a deal with Trump a few weeks ago that would have allowed them to suppress the protests in a moderate sort of way, hand over the remains of their nuclear material, and
Yes. Hello.
and get out without the defeat of their entire regime. But that's not what they decided to do. They decided to go the hard way, and they are now making long lists of people who are guilty of war crimes, very serious crimes, and they will all pay. If not this month, if not this year, in the foreseeable future, the Iranian regime is completely unsustainable.
And yesterday, Mr. Sadka, we saw that Iranian regime reach out to Saudi Arabia and some not traditional allies of Iran, right? Looking at Saudi Arabia and Qatar in particular, they haven't, not that I know of, but they haven't had good ties with Iran, but we saw that Iran reaching out to them. So why do you think this change comes, or where is Iran that cornered or desperate right now?
Iran is absolutely desperate. Its only significant ally that could possibly have helped it is Russia. And as we saw recently in Venezuela, Russia can't help their allies. They are much too busy in Ukraine. China is also in theory their ally, but China is much more concerned with stability, and they also don't have the ability to project power. So in total desperation, they appear to have been begging the Gulf Arabs, the Saudis, the Qataris, and so on, to help to intervene on their behalf. However, my understanding from speaking to people is that the Qataris and the Saudis actually want the Iranian regime gone too, or at the very least, they want it severely weakened. But they are unable to say that in public, and they see no particular reason to tie themselves to the demise of the regime when the regime will fall anyway in the hands of America and or Israel. So why do they want to tie themselves if it's going to happen anyway? It's extremely cowardly from them, but that really is the way the Middle East functions. So, for example, all these states, including Saudi Arabia, have long and extensive security links with Israel. And yet, at the same time, they pretend as if Israel is their enemy, when in fact it is Israel that is pretty much keeping them around. Ditto with Turkey and a few other states. They have no way to defend themselves, so they are very weak. They have to appease their population. And they also, at the same time, they might be concerned that a revolution, a successful revolution in Iran, might make their own population think twice. Why are they under a certain kind of theocratic rule themselves? The Saudi authorities are very oppressive, not as oppressive as Iran, and they're opening up somewhat. But yet it's not a democracy. It is a kind of religious dictatorship with a king and a crown prince that run the place. So it could be the population there might also become restive, as we saw 14, 15 years ago with the Arab Spring, that ultimately came to nothing except the destruction of Libya and Syria. But time will tell.
Yes, thank you for highlighting that and bringing that into our conversation, Mr. Sadka. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now, moving on to Syria, Syrian President Ahmad al-Shara is set to visit Berlin to meet German Chancellor Friedrich Merz with a focus on deportations of Syrians there. However, rights groups have criticized the visit, citing ongoing human rights abuses and ethnic persecution in Syria. On the other hand, the German government has stated that the treatment of minorities in Syria will be a major topic during the talks, rejecting claims that these issues are being ignored. Meanwhile, Germany is also pushing for the repatriation of Syrians who fled the war despite concerns over Syria's continued instability. Now, for this discussion, we welcome back Mr. Sol Sadka. Thank you very much, Mr. Sadka, for staying with us. Now, the upcoming, the talks between German Chancellor and Syrian President, what can we expect, and how do you think Germany will manage or manage to balance this, the refugee crisis that Germany went through, and now that a lot of, the right-wing uprising and people against immigration and stuff in Germany, with building relationship and trust with the new Syrian regime?
Well, there are currently some millions of Syrian refugees living in Germany. Merkel was extremely welcoming to them. They are relatively unpopular among the local German population, be that fairly or unfairly. And many of the German population, including the right wing in particular, would very much like the Syrians now to go home, seeing as Syria is no longer technically in a civil war. However, it seems unlikely because most of the Syrians in Germany have been there for a very long time, mostly more than a decade. They now speak German, they have children in Germany, they are effectively Germans. And they're very unlikely to want to go home from a country like Germany, where the average income is $60,000 per annum, to a place like Syria, where it's more like $600 per annum, and is as yet still in a phase of chaos. There is regular upticks in violence, there's minority ethnic tensions all over the place. I find it very unlikely that a large number of German Syrian citizens or refugees from Syria in Germany will decide of their own volition to go back to Syria, no matter what al-Jolani offers them, no wonder what the German government offers them. Most likely, if they are to leave, they will have to be taken out by force. And because Germany doesn't really control its own borders, because it's part of the Schengen zone, that's not really practical at all. Because even if you sent them back to Syria, they could be back anywhere in the European Union within days, and then they can simply make their own way without any kind of passport checks back into Germany. So realistically, because Germany has given up on control of its own borders, all this talk is meaningless.
We will be eyeing that. Thank you very much, Mr. Sol Sadka, for joining us from Tel Aviv and sharing that insight. That's all we have time for. Keep watching NewsX World for more news updates from around the world.